This is The Last Laugh. I'm Matt Wilstein from The Daily Beast, and today on the show, I'm thrilled to have as my guest a very funny comedian who has been writing for Late Night with Seth Meyers for nearly a decade now, and along with previous Last Laugh guest Amber Ruffin, is responsible for one of my favorite segments on that show, Jokes Seth Can't Tell. You can also catch her new live comedy show, Jenny Hagel Gives Advice, later this month at Joe's Pub in New York. Jenny Hagel, welcome to The Last Laugh.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
Yeah, it's so great to have you here. I feel like I'm catching you in the middle of a long late night break. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we take little breaks in the summer, which I think we all need because it's hard to stare directly at
Yeah.
the news for too long.
I was looking and I mean, you've been at the show at late night since 2016, right? Which means you're coming up on next year will be your 10-year anniversary at the show, which is kind of insane. I mean, did you think when you took that job that you would be there for a decade?
No, I thought I would be fired immediately. Um, I remember my first week at work, the woman who used to run our hair and makeup and wig department came to my desk and I was just hired as a writer. And she said, "Hey, when you have a moment, come by hair and makeup so I can measure your head for when we make you wigs for when you're on the show." And I thought, oh, that's so lovely of her, but I'll never be on the show. Like I'll do it because she asked me to, but obviously I will never be on the show. And I think 2 weeks later, I was on the show. Beyonce's album Lemonade dropped. Like there was that thing where she dropped like all those videos in the middle of the night, and we did
Hmm.
a parody of it. And literally 2 weeks later, I was being fitted for this like very long Beyonce style wig, and like it just immediately we were making a lot of wigs, but I that was such a pleasant surprise that it ended up being a job that I got to settle into and have a long relationship with. This is my longest relationship.
I love that you were the choice to play Beyonce on late night.
Oh, I was not. Yeah, I should be very clear about that. I was not. It was all of the female writers on
Oh,
staff
okay.
adopted styles that were inspired by the video.
What was the story behind joining the show in 2016? The show was pretty new at that point, right? I mean, it hadn't.
That's right. It was 2 years old, and I was living in New York. I was working as a TV writer, but on other different shows. I was working on a lot of cable shows. And I really, really wanted to be a late night writer. That was my dream. I felt like it would really combine, the performance skills that I had acquired at Second City, the writing skills that I had acquired there and in my MFA program. And I did a MFA in writing for screen and stage. And I just felt like, oh, I think this is something I could do. I would watch like late night shows and I think my brain can do that. And so I applied. I didn't have an agent, but sometimes I would hear about different shows that were hiring and I'd find a way to get a writing sample to them. And I had been doing that for 6 years. And I did, over the course of 6 or 7 years in New York, I think I submitted 35 different late night, like writing samples to different late night shows and applied. And sometimes I would hear nothing. Sometimes I would make it to the second round. A couple times I made it to the third round and I never got hired. And I thought, you know what, this is probably just not going to happen for me. And that is okay. But at one point, it was kind of starting to take a toll on me to do all of this work and come really close. And I thought, I almost am getting distracted from my current life by thinking so much about this life I wish I had. And I was working as a writer. It wasn't necessarily for my dream shows, but I thought, you know what if I maybe just stop doing this? Because I don't think it's going to happen. And what if I just really lean into the life that I have and appreciate the life that I have? And maybe like 2 days after I had that tough talk with myself, I'm really good friends with Amber Ruffin, and we had known each other since our 20s, since we were at Second City, and she had been writing for late night for 2 years. And I got this text from her. I remember it was on a Thursday night, and she said, "Hey, I think we're hiring. Do you want to send me a packet?" Which is what we late night writers call like those writing samples that you write for shows.
Hmm.
And it is truly, Matt, it is only because I was too embarrassed to tell her, like, "Oh no, I had a meeting with myself this week and I decided to give up on my dream." That was too embarrassing for me to say. So I said, "Sure, sure, I'll do a packet." And I thought the same thing will happen. I will work on this packet round the clock for 48 hours. I'll give it to Amber, and then again, I will not get hired. And then this will be the last one I do. And then I gave it to her and I got hired.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
it's really, I think it's the takeaway is to give up on your dreams.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Yeah, that's the lesson here is always give up on your dream and then things will happen for you.
That's right.
I started working at the Daily Beast at the end of 2015, which was sort of like right after Trump came down the, escalator and
Yes.
all that. So it's, similar time period.
Yes.
And it's this very disturbing thing where it feels like we're back where we started politically in the country, 10 years, almost 10 years later. Um, does it feel that way for you, going back to that news cycle and everything, or has it sort of felt like that the whole time? What have your feelings been, so far this year?
No, that's a great question. I think what's interesting about being a comedy writer is like, right, you're trying to write jokes about the world, but you're also a person living in the world. So I
Hmm.
feel like my feelings are kind of on the same trajectory that everybody else's feelings are, right? In the beginning, we were all kind of in disbelief in 2016. Well, in the beginning, we all thought it was a funny joke. Then there
Yeah,
was a
very
period
funny,
in 2016,
hilarious.
yeah, there's a period in 2016 where all of a sudden it didn't feel so, we were like, wait, he's going to get the nomination. Then he ran this insane campaign and we're like, okay, but he's not going to win. And then he won, and then we were all like numb for a few weeks. It's like I've kind of gone, and then there was like, I feel like a lot of his first term was people being like, well, what's the thing that's going to catch him? And then he won't finish out the term. I think we spent 4 years being like, well, there's no way he can do the whole, like, he's going to get caught. He's so sloppy and he does all these illegal. So I feel like there was like that ride. And then with Joe Biden, I felt like as a writer, it was like such a, like, I think I maybe thought about Joe Biden twice a month. Like, I
Yeah,
think I like
it was not
remember.
the dominant theme of the show.
Yeah. And I think there was some comfort in that. I'm not saying that because like he was like the world's edgiest or most progressive president. He wasn't necessarily carving out massive social change, but I just felt like I don't wake up every morning wondering like, did he tweet at someone in the middle of the night that they should bomb, like dare someone to bomb us?
Yeah.
And so I think there was like that part of the ride. And I think that the second Trump administration feels different to me in that it doesn't, not that I thought he was funny before, but it all seems so surreal. And I kept thinking
Hmm.
like, oh, this is going to end at some point. And I think I don't have that the second time around. And so it's not quite, I don't have as much of a stomach for making jokes about the silly things that he does because I feel like, no, this is very real. He will be president for 4 years. This will have very big impact. And so I think it's like, like it's a little more challenging for me to find the way into some of the news stories.
Yeah, I talked to Seth last fall, basically just a couple weeks before the election, and we were talking about it. At that point, it really did feel kind of like 50-50. We weren't
Mhm.
sure what was going to happen. And so I was asking him, how do you think the show will change if Trump is reelected? And, he kind of, I think he didn't want he wasn't ready for his brain to go there yet. And so, he was sort of still working through it. But now that it has, how do you feel like even just the day to day making the show has changed. Because I think since Seth has talked about that, he's sort of forced himself to enjoy it in a way that like it felt like you couldn't the
Mm.
first time, even as things get darker and darker. So I don't know, is that vibe felt throughout the staff, do you think, of sort of like finding ways to make this insanity fun?
I think honestly, the answer is different for everybody. And the answer is different for everybody every week, right? Because the news is different and it affects each person differently. So you have some weeks where um, the news is just general, kind of generalized chaos. And there are some weeks
Hmm.
where there's a story that hits you in a way that it might not hit somebody else on the staff. There also are just everybody goes through those cycles of like, I can handle the news in a professional way. My job is to analyze it and find satirical ways to write about it. And there's some weeks where just you're like, I don't know, man. As a human being in this world, I'm tired. And those weeks might hit different people differently. So to me, the show doesn't feel overall different at all because we're still doing the job of the show, of any late night show, right? Which is to read the news, react to the news, write about the news in a way that's comedic and satirical. And also sometimes when you feel like you need it, have a silly break from the news. And I think that fundamental job doesn't feel to me like it has changed.
Is there an example so far during this new term where there was a story that maybe you felt like, I don't know how we're gonna make this funny or make a joke about it, and then you cracked it in some way or found a way in?
Hmm. That is a really, that's a great point.
I know. I feel like some of this stuff it happens and then it just disappears from your brain like the next day, right?
I'll
Because
be
that's sort
honest.
of
I
the
think
nature of the show.
the speed at which late night moves. Yeah, I can't think of one in particular because I think it is just so much the job of the work is always just finding the way in. So I think you just kind of
Mm,
always end up finding a way in because you do. It's like like that it's something's due. So every time I sit down to write, especially in this administration, I'm like, there's no way I'm gonna come up with something. And then every time I do. And I'm not saying that, sometimes I feel like I really knock it out of the park, and sometimes I'm like, I don't know if that was my best. But every time you find a way in, because I think when you do this kind of work, that's how your brain is trained to interact with the news.
So besides that Beyonce sketch, which I have to admit I don't remember. I think the thing that most people know you from on the show has become jokes Seth can't tell with your friend Amber Ruffin, who, I think you've done more than 50 of them now over nearly 10 years. Can you talk about how that started? Because I believe it had something to do with the movie Carol. Is that right?
Something in that news realm. When I first started at late night, really very early on, maybe like the first couple months I was at late night, um, we would do this thing called a table read where every Thursday we would all sit around a conference room table and read sketches. Everybody brought in one sketch. And so they were due the night before, they were due on Wednesday. So usually sometime around Thursday or around Tuesday afternoon, you'd be like, okay, what am I bringing in this week? And earlier that week, again, because I was very new and I was just kind of trying to learn how to do everything, kind of settle in, I was also working on the monologue team, and we got a monologue set up that had something to do with some kind of piece of news related to lesbians. And can't remember if it was something about Carol or something, but I just thought, oh, here's my comedic sweet spot. And I wrote like 10
This
jokes.
is your moment.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, oh, they're going to be so glad they hired me. They're going to be high-fiving each other that they thought to hire this writer. So I turned in a bunch of monologue jokes, but probably 10 of them were about that news item. And then later on, I saw Alex Bays, our head writer, in the hallway, and I said, let me know if you need more lesbian jokes. And he said, we cannot use them. And I hadn't really thought about that, but I was like, oh, right, Seth can't tell a bunch of jokes ripping on lesbians. Like, that's not a good look. So I don't know, that kind of like burrowed its way into my brain. And then that following week, when we had to turn in a sketch, I went to Amber Ruff and I said, hey, what if we put this sketch together like jokes Seth can't tell? So we wrote it and we did a series. We did, some jokes that she told from her perspective, some from my perspective. But I certainly never, not that I was trying to like turn in something that wouldn't work, but I just thought there's no way this is going to go. And we were both absolutely shocked when it got chosen. And then we did it one time. And I really thought this will be a one-off. And then that night we got an email from one of the producers that said, hey, that was great. Let's plan on doing it again next month.
Wow. What was Seth's reaction to the idea when you pitched it to him? I don't know if you pitched it directly to him or how he sort of
Well, it was part of
received
that
it,
table
but
read. We read it and then
yeah.
moved along to the next sketch. And typically what will happen is we'll read a stack of like maybe 12 sketches. And then, Seth will say, thank you very much. And then we'll all leave. And then we'll get an email later letting us know what was chosen and what wasn't. And it's often not, things get chosen sometimes because they work, but also, or things will get passed on because they don't work. But sometimes things get passed on for all kinds of reasons. Like it might be funny, but expensive to make. Or it might feel like, oh, this is great, but it's about this week's news. And by the time we pull together the props and costumes we need, it would be next Monday and this will feel old. Like there's all kinds of, or this is good, but it feels a little close to something they did on Fallon. So you just really never know. No matter how funny sketches are, you really don't know what'll get chosen and what won't. So yes, it was a big surprise when we got that email later.
Yeah, I guess it is a very cheap and repeatable idea.
Turns out, turns out, cheap and repeatable. That's the theme of my career.
Um, the format of the sketch is very consistent, and it always ends with this bit where then you kind of cajole him into telling one of the jokes. Was that always there from the start when you had the idea that that's how it would end?
That was always there. Is that that was the very first draft. I believe that was Seth's idea for how to end it. I think the original draft we turned in had a different ending, and Seth was like, "What if you guys do this?" And so we said, "Okay." So we wrote that into the very first sketch, to the very first one, and then we rehearsed it in front of an audience, like in front of a test. We used to always have, again, before the pandemic when things were structured a little differently, we would have a 4:30 rehearsal where our interns would go to the gift shop at 30 Rock and just pull random strangers and be like, do you guys want to see a rehearsal of a late night show? And so these unsuspecting strangers would come up. We'd get maybe 30, 40 people. And Seth would read a bunch of possible monologue jokes. We'd do a bunch of possible sketches in front of them. And from their reactions, we would make edits, figure out what to put in that night's show. Maybe we'd retool a sketch for later on. So we did the first joke Seth can't tell for a test audience like that. And we were in front of this rehearsal audience at the end, after Seth told his jokes, then Seth yelled, "Black women and lesbians are liars." And we laughed so hard because he was just an improvised line. We laughed so hard and we thought, well, and then we both privately, Amber and I thought like, well, obviously he's not going to say that tonight when we shoot the real show, because the show was that night, like an hour and a half later. And he did. And we laughed so hard because I was like, well, obviously he's never going to say that on television. And it is such a delight that he did and has continued to. It makes me laugh so hard every time.
The premise of the sketch is that these are jokes that are that Seth can't tell from his perspective, and they're sort of like that may have been cut from the monologue, as you said, for that reason. But I imagine there are also jokes that get cut from jokes Seth can't tell because they are go too far. Is that true?
Correct.
And can you
That's
think of
correct.
any that you wanted to put in there, and for whatever reason you said this actually is even too far for this segment where we go too far?
That's so funny. I don't think we've ever cut one because it goes too far. Because I mean,
Hmm.
Amber is black. I am queer.
Yeah, and that's kind of the idea, right?
Well, yeah, and also like I'm not trying to say something shitty, but I
Yeah.
think I think they get cut more often because they will get too specific. And so I feel
Mm.
like a really interesting line that we're always kind of riding is you want to tell a joke that's specific because jokes that are specific are fun. They're funny, they're more interesting. A detailed joke is always more interesting than a bland generic joke. But with these two particular the populations that we're writing about, the middle space is okay, we want to be specific, but if you're so specific that a straight or white audience doesn't get it, then no one's having a good time. So
Hmm.
sometimes you rely on like, you have to kind of be like, do they know this stereotype? Or are there enough context clues in the joke that as they're hearing the joke, they're learning the stereotype and then they can laugh along with. So I think we cut jokes more often for that reason. Like I think I've written a bunch of jokes about how long lesbians' first dates are, but it turns out that's not a thing that people know. It's very common for lesbians to go on a first date and it lasts like 8 hours. It's very common for lesbians to break up but then still live together for a while.
Right, yeah.
But I
But
think
that didn't connect.
those I will say those two areas I've never quite been able to land a joke there.
Yeah.
I wrote a joke one time that I was so convinced was so funny that Seth tried to cut it in a meeting before we even did it in front of the rehearsal audience, and I was like, "Trust me, every woman knows this, and this is hilarious." And it was about the fact that it's very common when women take an antibiotic. If you mess up, if you skip a dose or whatever, it's often if you don't do it exactly right, it's very common for women to get a yeast infection. And I wrote a joke that was about that, but it had to do with bees. They were testing some antibiotic on bees, and there was something about that. And then I said, so if you're a bee, that explains your yeast infection. Matt, I thought this was the funniest joke in the history of jokes. And I was just like, I don't get it. I was like, women will get it. And so I told it and it got nothing. And Seth razzed me so hard, as he should have. But I think
Yeah.
that's it. It's like you don't know what, sometimes you have to kind of tiptoe out to this line of specificity to find out what people do and don't know and what they can pick up so that they, because people want to come along for the ride. Everybody wants to laugh when they're hearing a joke.
Hmm.
You're kind of experimenting with how much information do I have to give them along the way? How much can I give them? How much do I trust them to put the pieces together? And that's kind of I don't know, as a comedy writing nerd, that's a fun exercise for me to kind of find out where those nuances are.
Yeah. The segment got big enough that you then started bringing guests in occasionally, that you've done. And I think, obviously probably the biggest one was Hillary Clinton joining you guys at the desk, to tell jokes. It was just about a year after the 2016 election, so
Right.
not too long after everything that happened there. What was that like to bring her in? Were you involved in sort of pitching the idea of her doing it? And then what was it like to actually have her tell jokes sort of at her own expense?
I think they let us know that she was, I think it might have been like Seth and Mike Shoemaker's idea to have her. I don't think we pitched that,
Mhm.
but they let us know. They said Hillary's going to do, I said Hillary like I know her, like we're friends.
Yeah.
Secretary Clinton's going to do jokes I can't tell. So we went about then trying to write, because we thought like, okay, well, what is a joke that is so specifically from Hillary Clinton's point of view that
Hmm.
only she could tell? So we went about, Amber and I wrote some jokes. The other monologue writers wrote a bunch of jokes, and we chose one and sent it to her team and said, would she be willing to tell this joke? And to her great credit, I thought this was so cool. We got a message back from her team that said she loves it, but she'd love to tell more. Do you have more? And I just thought, number one, that's so brave for somebody who's not a comedian to be like, let me
Yeah.
try a couple swings. Let me take a couple swings. But also, I feel like Hillary Clinton unfairly gets so much criticism for the way she laughs, her sense of humor, the jokes she tells. And I thought, like, what a lovely thing to just be like, yeah, let me tell more jokes. I don't care. Like, I thought that was very cool because sometimes people who aren't comedians can be nervous. Like, we've asked some people to do it who are like, you know what, I'd rather not because I'm not a comedian. I don't think I'll do it a good job. And I really admired that she was like, yeah, I'll tell one and give me two more. It was great. And I thought she did such an excellent job.
Yeah. Did anyone ask Kamala to come do it before the election?
I don't know. I actually don't know. So much of the booking is done through a different department.
Yeah, yeah. If only she had done it, maybe that would have changed everything.
I don't know that we have that kind of power, man. I wish I could say we did.
No, if she had done that and Joe Rogan, then that would have changed everything.
That's it, and that's what
Yeah.
everybody has to do to win an election in this country.
I do find the segment so fascinating because it is sort of like the opposite of this anti-woke comedy idea that, you know, we should be able to say whatever we want and male comedians, punching down at trans women and all this. And you guys are saying, no, you can make jokes that are outrageous in some way or even play on stereotypes in some way, but it has more to do with who's telling the joke and the perspective that it's coming from versus even just what the joke is. And that's sort of the whole idea is that it's certain people are either allowed or to tell a joke or it's accepted and received in a different way when they do. Um, how do you think about that?
I think that's right. I think that what I really don't what I here's what I think it's very disingenuous where people are like, well, we can say whatever you want. It's a joke. I think some jokes are jokes, and some jokes are bullying disguised as jokes. So I think it's often, to me, the biggest thing is what is the intent behind it? Because like, what are you actually trying to say with that joke? And I can, if I made a joke, let's say, for example, like if we were doing jokes off count, I made a joke that addressed a black issue. What am I trying to say? Am I trying to say like, hey, as an outsider, I don't understand it? Am I trying to highlight some way in which Black Americans are treated less fairly than other Americans? What am I trying to say? Or am I trying to make fun of people that are a part of a community that I'm not part of and who have less social standing than someone who looks like me? So the question to me isn't what is the joke? Well, I mean, first of all, like first and foremost, the question is what is your intent? Why are you telling it? And I think that so often when people cry woke, what they're doing is they want to say a mean thing. They just really, it's burning, a burning desire in their heart is to say a mean thing. And then what they want to do is use the word joke as a shield and say like,
Hmm.
well, I can say whatever I want. It's a joke. Like, and I think the other thing is people don't enjoy consequences. So like, yeah, you can say that. You can get on stage and say whatever you want. But there isn't like a soundproof booth around. Like you say that, and then there will be a reaction to what you said. And it to me, it's also very cowardly to be like, well, I'm only interested in the reaction if it's a good one. Like
Yeah.
you get
Yeah.
up on stage and tell a joke, you take the risk.
Yeah. I mean, they sort of hide behind that they hide behind it's a joke and they hide behind the idea that, but I'm a comedian, so like stop taking me so seriously.
That's right. But
And
then you
that,
want to be taken seriously when it goes well. Like you can't
yeah,
have it both ways. And I don't care
yeah,
for that. I really don't care for that.
yeah,
And if I make a misstep and I say something, if I use outdated language or say something that reads one way to me, but another way to a community that I'm not part of that I didn't think of, I would like to hear that because I would like to not make that mistake in the future. Then,
yeah,
shame on me, and I hope I do better in the future. So I certainly think comedians can mess up, and I think comedians can. I think there are areas that they look. They don't. We have the First Amendment. They can say whatever they want, but then you have to live in the aftermath of what you said.